Why is the governor breaking the law? What interests is he attempting to satisfy versus the interests that are being represented by your report and the wonderful information that you shared? That is the interest of the people of the state of New York. What is going on here? Who's benefiting from this governor's effort not to enforce the law? Why is he turning a blind eye to this very serious problem?
Well, number one, you have to ask the governor, right? I mean, only he knows. I mean, we've written so many letters now for 5 years, respectful, technically detailed, and citing the law, chapter and verse, ad nauseam, excruciating detailed letters, and he won't respond. He won't address the problems of the revised draft. That's, guys, 22,000 signatories to a coalition letter asking him to address these wastewater and regulatory exemption issues. He won't do it. And so the bottom line is he probably doesn't want to halt shale fracking in New York. He said that he wants to benefit economically, but he also said that all watersheds are sacrosanct, and he's going to make a final decision based on science. But as you know, this whole Department of Health review, shrouded in secrecy, it's never been written on a piece of paper, no public participation whatsoever, and that's probably why Dr. Shaw checked out, because he couldn't take the heat in the kitchen anymore. So the governor has to answer these questions. We don't know. Why aren't you cleaning up the contamination that's threatening New York City's drinking water? You can go by Mexico Reservoir. I was there not long ago, and there's a containment boom in one corner of the landfill where oil has been leaking into that site. There's a Department of Transportation landfill that's been leaking into the reservoir. So these are very important issues. They have not been a priority for the governor. They haven't, frankly, been a priority for recent governors. So that's how, when it comes to protecting public health and the environment, it's very hard. Takes a lot of money, takes a lot of staff, takes a lot of scientists, and you take the hit. You take a lot of heat from the polluters that don't want to pay their fair share. That's how come with regard to Marcellus Shale, it's prevention. That is how we have avoided the problems in other states, because we haven't allowed it, frankly, because of your efforts, Senator Kruger and your colleagues in the Assembly who have done so much for 5 years. And we're just saying, I'm not personally against natural gas. I use it to cook, I use it to heat. I'm just against pollution. And so I know how to look at the requirements, and I know how to trip the wire or require the requisite studies. It's very hard. But the governor has not done that kind of rigorous approach on Marcellus Shale. So I invite you to ask him.
Thank you very much. I know we have to move on, but I'm glad that you asked us to ask him, and I guess we will.
Thank you very much for an absolutely outstanding job by all of our first panel panelists. Thank you for your outstanding work. Our second panel will be looking at potential public health impacts and concerns. Here with us today are Dr. Earl T. Robinson, MD from Elmira, New York, Kathleen Nolan, MD, MSL, Research Director at Catskill Mountain Keeper, and Wes Gillingham, Program Director of the Catskill Mountain Keeper. Thank you so much for being with us. We look forward to your testimony. And with that, as soon as you are settled, we will start with Dr. Earl Robinson from Elmira. Thank you, Dr. Robinson.
So, Earl Robinson. I'm a pulmonary critical care physician practicing medicine in Chemung County for the last 36 years. Chemung County has the highest death rate from lung cancer in New York State. Chemung County also has some of the highest levels of measured radon in New York State. The overall survival from a diagnosis of lung cancer at 5 years is less than 10%. The survival at 5 years for stage 1 lung cancer, which has the best prognosis, is less than 40%. Radium produces radon gas. Radon-222 decays, producing alpha, beta, and gamma radiation. The two radon decay products, polonium-218 and polonium-214, are the most hazardous. You probably remember the Russian spy in London that was poisoned with polonium. The amount of polonium would be almost invisible that he took that killed him. The alpha radiation produced in the lung can damage the lung's DNA and cause a cell to become mutated, which causes lung cancer. And how it does this is by hitting and damaging the cancer suppressant gene or by ionization of material surrounding the DNA. The probability of developing lung cancer is related to the concentration of radon and the amount of time the person is exposed to radon. Approximately 22,000 radon-induced lung cancer deaths in the United States each year, which is 11% of the total lung cancer deaths. Radon causes lung cancer in both smokers and non-smokers. Now, you've heard the picocurie thing we've gone to. A picocurie is 2 nuclear disintegrations per minute. The amount of radon in ambient air is about 0.4 picocuries per liter. So even in ambient air, outside air, a smoker has a risk of 3 lung cancer deaths per 1,000 over a lifetime. U.S. indoor air averages 1.3 picocuries per liter. So a smoker inside with ambient air, 20 smokers per 1,000 will develop lung cancer, just being inside. At 2 picocuries, expect 32 smokers per 1,000 to get lung cancer in a lifetime. The risk obviously increases with radon exposure. At 20 picocuries per liter, quarter of smokers will get lung cancer. 260 smokers per 1,000, or 25% of the total. Non-smokers would be 36 per 1,000. Radon is the #1 cause of lung cancer in non-smokers. In Chemung County basements, the average radon level is 12.5 picocuries per liter. And the first floor of the houses is 6.06 picocuries per liter. I talked to a physicist in Colorado just before this talk, and he told me that there are areas in Colorado where in the ambient air, they measured up to 20 picocuries per liter. And actually, some of the people that are mining for uranium, they drive around with the meter out the window, and when they find 20 picocuries per liter, they're pretty sure there's uranium in the area for mining. Luckily, we don't have that. Radium-226 is present in fracking waste with a higher concentration of radium found in the Marcellus Formation. Spreading thousands of tons of material containing radon producing radium-226 would be expected to increase the level of radon in air over these deposits. As noted, radium-226 has a half-life of 1,600 years, so it's not going away. Between July 2013 and December 2013, 500,000 tons of drilling waste were produced in Pennsylvania. So over a year, you'd expect 1 million tons of drilling waste produced in Pennsylvania. The Chemung County landfill received over 300,000 tons of drilling waste so far. Now, in the fracking waste, not only is there radium, there's also uranium and strontium, all of which are radioactive materials. Just briefly, there are 4 naturally occurring isotopes of radium: radium-228, radium-226, radium-224, radium-223, and 224, 226, and 228 decay products are classified as Group 1 carcinogens, known carcinogens to humans. Some of the early studies on radium date back to the early 1900s when they had girls painting radium dials on watches and ingesting the radium. Follow-up on that was a lot of them developed osteosarcoma. because the radium went into the bones, replacing calcium. It's the same type of material. U.S. EPA also notes that in addition to bone cancer, protracted exposure to inhaled or ingested radium-226 can cause lymphoma, leukemia, and aplastic anemia. Now, if you're in an area where you spread hundreds of tons or thousands of tons of Marcellus across an area, and you're running bulldozers over that, and there's radon coming off of that, and you've got dust, you're going to inhale that. It's going to go into your lungs, you're going to cough it up, you're going to swallow it. 15 to 20% of the radium ingested will be absorbed and deposited. The acceptable risk of residual radioactive material is 15 milligrams per year. Now, most people have 360 milligrams per year of radiation exposure. 15 milligrams is not a very high number. There's no evidence of any milligram per year samples taken at the landfills receiving drilling waste from Pennsylvania, nor has there been any testing of radon gas at the landfills receiving Marcellus drill cuts. We've heard some references to what would be going on in a truck, and obviously we have an enclosed space, and we have radium in there. You're going to have more higher concentration of radon. As Mr. Abraham mentioned, we've looked at the leachate from the Chemung County landfill and noticed an increase in radioactivity over time. And obviously, leachate goes to the sewage plant, and then it's dumped into the Chemung River. And because it lasts for 1,600 years, it's not going to go away. And it will be accumulating. So, in 1986, the New York State Department of Health did a study of aquifers in New York State prior to the possible siting of a low-level radioactive waste dump. To avoid locating such a landfill over an aquifer, the Chemung County landfill is located over an aquifer on the New York State natural aquifers, and now it's received upwards of 300,000 tons of Marcellus waste. So we actually have put a low-level radioactive waste dump on top of an aquifer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Robinson. If you'd kindly stay until the conclusion of the panel, that would be helpful. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Kathleen Nolan, Research Director at the Catskill Mountain Keeper. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Senators, for the opportunity to provide testimony on this extremely important topic. I'm a board-certified pediatrician with fellowship-level training in epidemiology and research design. I also hold a master's of study in law and currently serve as research director for Catskill Mountain Keeper. Before addressing the public health implications of how we handle the waste byproducts associated with hydraulic fracturing, also known as fracking or unconventional natural gas development, I want to emphasize that my discussion does not presuppose any given position regarding the process of hydraulic fracturing. These comments hold true whether or not a ban or moratorium on hydraulic fracturing as a method of obtaining fuel is enacted in New York State. Currently, no permits for high-volume hydraulic fracturing are being issued in New York State. Yet, as we've been hearing, we already face issues related to the disposal, processing, and secondary use of the hydraulic fracturing waste byproducts. Non-gaseous hydraulic fracturing waste products fall roughly into two categories: liquid waste and solid waste. Today, we're not addressing at all the gaseous waste, which include methane itself, radon, and volatile organic compounds. Those are also harmful, but they're outside of today's discussion. Both liquid and solid forms of waste contain toxic chemicals, heavy metals, and radioactive contaminants. The toxic chemicals originate primarily in the fracking fluid that is injected underground to fracture and keep open the shell deposits located roughly a mile underground, while the heavy metals and the radioactive contaminants originate from those deep shale layers. In simple terms, the fracking fluids go into the well and dissolve the heavy metals and radioactive elements present in the shale, mobilizing them and potentially contaminating the waste that emerges from the well, whether it's liquid, solid, or semi-solid material. As described by the Environmental Protection Agency, radioactive waste from oil and gas will take the form of produced water, drilling mud, sludge, slimes, evaporation ponds, and pits. It can also concentrate in mineral scales that form in pipes, called pipe scale, or in storage tanks or other extraction equipment. The toxic nature of many of these waste materials has been well described, despite laws protecting the proprietary nature of the fracking fluids. As characterized by my colleague Paul Rubin, who joins me in this testimony today, he's a professional hydrogeologist who has conducted research on this issue, primarily in Pennsylvania. Quoting Mr. Rubin, these water fluids can commonly exhibit highly elevated concentrations of bromide, chloride, hardness as calcium carbonate, total dissolved solids, barium, boron, calcium, iron, lithium, magnesium, manganese, potassium, sodium, strontium. Furthermore, these gas industry fluids water sometimes also include many additional chemicals, including but not limited to the following: pyridine, ethylbenzene, benzene, toluene, xylenes, 1,2,4-trimethylbenzene, 1,3,5-trimethylbenzene, arsenic, assorted phthalates, assorted metals, fluorine, phenol, 2-propanol, butyl alcohol, propylene glycol, ethanol, phenanthrene, and other chemical compounds. Other drilling mud include contaminants that include aluminum, titanium, 2-butyron, and 1,2,4-trimethylbenzene. I list these in some details because many of these waste products should be familiar to us. They've been identified as contaminants in soil, sediment, and water previously at a hazardous waste site that later came to be known as the Love Canal Superfund site in Niagara Falls, New York. I presented a table that lists the compounds and elements that were found at Love Canal that are also found in fracking waste. The Love Canal property, having been used in the 1930s and 40s as a landfill for the disposal of over 21,000 tons of various chemical waste, buried 25 feet underground in the canal, contaminated nearby groundwater, which then rose to the surface and drained into the Niagara River, contaminating it as well. Contaminants also migrated from the landfill to local sewers, which drained into nearby creeks. Eventually, approximately 950 families had to be evacuated from the area surrounding the landfill. Contamination at that site ultimately led to the passage of federal Superfund legislation. I mention this not only because there is some overlap in the products that are involved, which is not accidental. Petroleum products are used to make fertilizers and plastics and other chemicals, but also because of the difficulties that that community had in obtaining recognition and help for the problems that they saw there. It took decades. And also to mention how expensive the cleanup was when that cleanup came after the fact and not prior to the contamination taking place. Now, radiation was not a major concern at the Love Canal Superfund site, but it is a major concern, as we've been hearing here, in regard to fracking waste from the Marcellus Shale. Just last week, a group of leading public health experts wrote to Governor Cuomo urging his administration to conduct studies and human health risk assessment of the occurrence of radon and radium during drilling for natural gas before deciding whether to allow drilling in New York's portion of the Marcellus Shale, or the distribution to New Yorkers of Marcellus Shale gas containing unhealthy levels of radon. I didn't quote it here, but the letter also talks about radium being fracking waste. And to make public any and all data collected about the presence of these carcinogenic radioactive elements in Marcellus Shale drilling. I'm appending a copy of that letter and would ask that you consider it part of my testimony. It's also available online at Concerned Health Professionals of New York.earth. studies have shown that this waste can be radioactive, in some cases highly radioactive. We've heard about studies that show that the radioactive contents can be thousands of times higher than is found in other shales. And the level of radioactivity is likely to be much greater in horizontally fracked wells than in vertically fracked wells, because you have a much greater exposure of the drilling apparatus to the shale. A recent study from Penn State's Department of Geosciences also found that fracking wastewater contains high levels of radium, along with the heavy toxic metal barium. Another report written by Adam White, a career scientist for the National Council on Radiation Protection, came to similar conclusions, confirming that fracking can produce waste with extremely high levels of radiation. The EPA talks about this problem and says that radionuclides in the waste from oil and gas drilling are primarily radium-226, radium-228, and radon gas. The radon is released to the atmosphere while the produced water and mud containing radium are placed in ponds or pits for evaporation, reuse, or recovery. The EPA goes on to say that people most likely to be exposed to this source of radiation are workers at the site. Now, that may be true. There's maybe the greatest risk. But the EPA's guidance to the workers should give us pause, because it applies even more, I think, to the general public. Under heading "What you can do to protect yourself," the EPA advises as follows: do not reuse or bring home discarded equipment or materials such as pipes, devices, bricks, rocks, or water. In other words, leave it at the site. Limit exposures and disturbance of the production site and any abandoned equipment. Leave it at the site. And do not handle, dispose, or reuse abandoned equipment used at drilling sites. Leave it at the site. So, how do exposures to these toxic materials occur to individuals who do not work there, who do not go to the fracking sites? And what are the health implications of such exposures? The public is exposed to these fracking waste through several mechanisms. Fluids delivered to treatment plants unable to remove the contaminants. Second, waste materials inadequately contained at landfills. Third, legally authorized applications to roads and fields, or as recently proposed for Pennsylvania and apparently not yet happening in New York, disposal in road construction materials. Actually put the fracking material into a type of block so that you can use it in building a new road. 4, intentional illegal dumping in fields and streams. 5, toxic spills during transport. 6, leaching from toxic waste buried at or near the fracking sites. And 7, direct contamination of drinking water sources from fracking activities. Notice that most of these routes of contamination pose a threat to areas that are far removed from the site of the fracking activities, and certainly could be across state lines. Putting waste from oil and gas fields on roads, fields, vineyards, and fairgrounds, all activities that have been permitted by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation during the past decade, is hydrogeologically equivalent to pouring these toxic materials directly into our waterways. The chemicals, brine, and waste residues run directly from roads into ditches and then almost immediately into surface waters. Similarly, materials leaching from landfills or spilled during transport will invariably flow under the pull of gravity down to surface or groundwaters. Unfortunately, studies suggest that some of these materials, including the radioactive elements, can, in very small concentration, parts per million, parts per billion, or smaller, cause serious, sometimes life-threatening illness, including tissue and organ damage, neurologic disorders, leukemia and solid tumors, miscarriages, stillbirth, and congenital malformations. The spectrum of conditions seen in the people at Buffalo. Worse, in areas that have high background loads of radiation or heavy metals, or that have suffered previous toxic contamination from previous Superfund sites, the effects of additional contamination may be cumulative or even synergistic. That is, it can be worse than either one of the contaminations alone. And the idea that, well, the place already has pollution, it's not that much more, is simply not correct from a medical and immunological perspective. In addition, sorting out the causal mechanisms of an observed illness in such settings can be very difficult. And I've experienced that personally when trying to sort out complaints brought by people living in communities that have had multiple exposures. In short, fracking waste are materials clearly recognizable in other circumstances as hazardous waste. Indeed, many of them are found on the EPA's list of priority chemicals to be eliminated from or substantially reduced through limiting production, or at a minimum, recovered and recycled on-site. Fracking wastes are not treated as hazardous waste due to federal and state exemptions that use the power of pencil and paper and human imagination to wipe out almost all legal obligations to protect the public from what would otherwise be preventable, highly toxic, and potentially lethal exposures. I can see no reason to relieve this industry of its obligation to handle its waste without harming the public. I applaud legislation designed to prevent transport of hydraulic fracturing waste or waste byproducts into or out of New York for treatment, discharge, disposal, or storage purposes, to prohibit the acceptance of wastewater from oil and natural gas extraction activities in New York's wastewater facilities and landfills, and to treat waste as hazardous waste on the basis of its hazardous characteristics without regard to its origin. I'm happy to provide further information and answer any questions as needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nolan. Next on the panel is Wes Gillingham, Program Director of Catskill Mountain Keeper.
So I'm Wes Gillingham, the Program Director for Catskill Mountain Keeper. Thank you for inviting us, giving us the opportunity to testify on this extremely important issue. My colleagues have outlined some very technical scientific documentation. I'm going to, what you have in front of you is actually two documents prepared for comments on the revised draft generic environmental impact statement. We submitted these along with NRDC, Hudson River Keeper, Earth Justice, and Delaware River Keeper. I printed these documents and brought them here because they go through a lot of the issues in terms of the politics of this, the lack of the regulatory structure that's been created or is being proposed at this point. The first document you have is prepared by Glenn Miller, Dr. Glenn Miller. The second document by Ralph Sealer. You'll see in the documentation that it refers to information coming from the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease, Halliburton Energy Services, National Risk Management Research Lab, among others, including the EPA. So if you look at the first document, the revised, the one that says the review of on the top, and you go through the first page, you'll see sections in bold, and it refers to a lot of what has been covered today, such as at the bottom of the first page, is salts and other inorganic constituents, metals and metalloids in the formation, water that are brought to the surface both as flowback and as production brines. These represent some of the biggest regulatory problems in terms of dealing with this. But what we have here is a situation in New York. First and foremost, this is for horizontal drilling and hydrofracking in high volume situations. But what we have is what was pointed out earlier by Walter Hang, is that there is relatively little difference between high volume and low volume. That's a very important distinction, and the fact that we are dealing with a situation of waste coming in from Pennsylvania, which is fairly difficult to track what is high volume and what is low volume. We have a situation where they're recycling the wastewater, and you can have high volume wastewater coming from a site going to a low volume site and being reused. So it's an example of a ridiculous regulatory structure. So again, I emphasize there's relatively little difference there. there's a distinction that we have come to over the last 6 years in New York. We've gone through an education process where we've actually learned the implications of gas drilling. All the implications of gas drilling. 6 years ago, when the landmen first came to our area, the Catskills, and were running around offering leases and the prices kept going up, the reaction by a lot of people was, well, what's the matter with gas drilling? You know, I have a stove in my house, what's the deal with gas drilling? We're no longer in the dark about this. We're watching what's happening in Pennsylvania, North Dakota, Colorado, and many other states. We know that bromides, which are one of the salts that comes back up in wastewater, can mix with chlorine, which is used in a public water supply system, can mix and cause trihalomethane, an extreme carcinogen. We know that a beneficial use determination is an abomination of a regulatory magic that enables an industry that's threatening our water and our air and the future of our communities. It just allows them to release that into our environment. A beneficial use determination takes something that should be kept from the public, from the environment, from our water sources, and from our air, and allows it to be released. We know that labeling waste from oil and gas industry can be hazardous, and it should be labeled as such. And when it is extremely hazardous, again, it should not be released into the environment. Wastewater coming from Pennsylvania gas fields in the form of wastewater that goes to our public treatment facilities, and the waste that comes from drill cuttings and goes to our landfills, is not something that we should just prevent, but it was something that we should fix. We are living with a history of oil and gas in New York State that we need to deal with. As mentioned by folks earlier, there's contamination from improperly plugged wells and lots of activity, historical activity. Before we allow the continued exposure to our people and the environment of these toxins, we need to look at what has already happened in this state. What health problems exist in Painted Post because of a long history of the drill cuttings going to the landfill there or at the Chemung County landfill? What problems exist around Auburn because they've been dealing with this wastewater for years? Who's tracking the leachate that's coming from the landfill and then going to a public waste treatment facility and then being exposed to the public? That needs to be documented and looked at. Not only should these activities be suspended, but we should immediately design and implement an analysis of contamination from these facilities that have been accepting this waste. This is a serious health threat to the people of New York State and is most likely already having detrimental effects to the people living in those places. This isn't even mentioning the spills and accidents that have occurred. Senator Kruger, you mentioned this is pretty scary. This is extremely scary. We live in a world where we're exposed to multiple contaminants from our modern lifestyles. But we live in a world where our dependence and our lack of political will to move away from carbon-based fuels is actually changing the future of our entire planet. We need to stop coddling the oil and gas industry. Make them accountable today for the damage that they have caused to our communities and our environment. And we need to prevent that from continuing. I support the work of this body and the bills that have been written to try to fix this, but we need to generate the political will to change the future, protect our children, protect our environment, and and move away from allowing the oil and gas industry ruining our communities across New York. Thank you.
Thank you all three.
I have 2 questions. So when you spoke to Governor Cuomo, what did he say? Now, have you had a chance to speak?
He doesn't talk to me on a regular basis. In
Anyone
fact,
else want to
I've
share?
never talked to Governor.
Okay. Anyone else get a chance to share your points of view with the governor? Because it's very important that he know. Just in case, I just want to know for the record.
I haven't spoken with him, but I've sent some letters,
And
have not received
how
a
has he
reply.
responded? How has he not responded there? The governor waiting to hear from the governor.
Wait.
Now, there are those who are claiming that the economic effects of hydrofracking on local economies is good. You know? And if anybody want to answer that?
I can address
It's
that.
good for the economy. That's I think what the governor's also claiming as well. So just want to get a sense of, from your point of view, I believe your health is your wealth. So I just want to get a sense how you respond to something like that.
I would respond to this by saying that, just by saying it's good to the economy, whoever is making that statement is obviously looking at a very narrow analysis of what the gas industry is bringing to our state. They're looking at maybe job figures, which actually, if you look at what's happening in Pennsylvania right now, they're not as rosy as they said in the beginning. And there's a serious downturn in jobs created. And they are not taking a full analysis of the impacts of the damage to the roads, the damage to our water sources, and the environment. And right now, we in New York State, even though we haven't allowed for horizontal drilling and hydrofracking to go forward, we are dealing with an infrastructure onslaught coming from the gas fields in the form of pipelines. The industry is furiously trying to make connections in their web of pipelines to get it to the coast for export. They're putting in compressor stations. And there's a whole host of, again, regulatory problems that exist today that are not protecting New Yorkers. It ranges from the wastewater to something as simple as a compressor station that they're building in Hancock right now. I've been analyzing what's been happening there. When they are putting the compressor station down for repair, they empty 10 miles of pipe. And I have a question for me that brings up, okay, 10 miles of methane being released into the environment along the pipeline. Is that normal? Does that happen at all these compressor stations? Or are they releasing 20 miles of them because it just happens to be where the next valve is? The industry has gotten away with business as usual and doing things the way they want to do because people haven't been paying attention. That's what we're doing here today, is paying attention to what they've been doing. So I don't see the answer as that it's just good for jobs. There's a whole host of things happening here that we need to focus on and change.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that too. The usual thing that I've seen is that initially real estate prices go up, hotels, restaurants, more people buying things, doing things. And then once all the wells are drilled, you're done. These people are out of there. Then everything goes back down again. Real estate prices go down. And then if there's pollution or there's damage to the environment, the value of the property goes down. The New York State Bar Association put out in their journal in, I think it was October 2013, an article on the impact of drilling. Now, when you drill, when you have drilling on your property, it's not a lease, you're a partner. Anything that happens on your property, you're responsible for. If you have a mortgage, your mortgage could be canceled because you're doing something dangerous on your property. If you have insurance policy on your property, it could be canceled because you're doing something dangerous on your property. Down in Pennsylvania, some of the drilling companies didn't pay, some of the gas companies didn't pay the drilling companies. The drilling companies put liens on the patient, on the people's property because they are part of the deal. If you have a drilling operation, whether you want to be a part of it or not, and you're forced into it, and you contaminate your neighbor's water supply, you are liable. You know, there's a lot of complications with this thing. It's not just putting a hole in the ground and getting the gas back out. And so, if you look out west, there was a gold mine thing going on there in the west. And now if you go back there, they're ghost towns. There's nothing left. They destroyed the place. They left. The gold's gone. What's going to happen when all the gas is gone? The other thing I've talked to some of the senators about is, which way do those gas lines go? Do they go both ways, or do they only go one way? They only go one way. You drill the thing, you put the pipe in, the gas goes out. Doesn't come back to your home, or your farm, or your community. It goes someplace else. Because that's where the money is.
I would agree with that. I would also mention that this economy, whatever it is, coming from this industry, is like the fuel itself, not a renewable economy. It doesn't keep going. Renewable energy sources are renewable in terms of their economics for the community as well. So you keep, with solar and with wind, you keep people in the neighborhood who have to repair machinery and update. And there's a much better small business model around other forms of energy than this form of energy. So if we're looking for the energy segment of the economy for our boost, then I think we should look towards the renewables. In New York State, we have not traditionally relied heavily on the energy sector. We have tourism, and we have agriculture, and those segments can be harmed by this industry. So those economic analysis need to be done in a way that takes into account the big picture. And I did want to address Senator Kruger's earlier question about the scariest practice we have, because I think that's really good one. I think to find another practice that scares me as much as this one, we have to look back to, historically, to the time when there were paints of different colors running down the Hudson River. Because that's the kind of almost willful blindness and willingness to use our most precious resources, in that case the water, in this case the water, as our dumping ground. I think we should be smarter than that.
I want to thank you all, and Doctor, your testimony where you highlight the parallels to Love Canal, I think are such a critical historic point for us to not gloss over. I foolishly said a few years ago, I don't think it was foolish, but in retrospect, I said, well, if we choose to frack in the state, we will eventually stop because we will have some man-made disaster like Love Canal. But I would prefer we don't make the mistake and have to fix the problem afterwards. But I think what all of your testimony today is highlighting to me is even though we haven't fracked, we are still facing Love Canal-like risks to the health of our population and to the water system, so that it's not enough to simply say, well, at least we haven't started to frack here yet, because what all of you are testifying to is the fact that real problems are occurring, real risks are happening right now in our state. And again, appreciate for anyone who might be too young to remember Love Canal, people go back and do a little homework on what happened there